Everyone says they want peace. Every leader calls war a tragedy, a failure, a last resort. And yet every country on earth is preparing for one. Armies are expanding, budgets exploding, alliances tightening, and the line between defense and aggression keeps getting thinner. If no one wants a world war, why does the world act like it's already begun? In 2024, global military spending reached $2.7 trillion, the highest figure in human history. In 2025, it has already passed $2.9 trillion, and according to projections from SIPRI, by 2026, it could exceed $3 trillion. Never before has the world spent so much preparing for a war it cannot afford to fight. The United States alone accounts for nearly 40% of that total, followed by China, Russia, and the European Union. Each claims to be spending in the name of security, yet real security is shrinking. Every dollar invested in deterrence seems to bring the world closer to miscalculation. The system is walking an ever thinner line, where a single exercise, a single statement, or a single mistake could push entire regions over the edge. For Washington, this constant buildup carries a hidden cost: rising debt, scattered resources, and a slow erosion of global credibility. But the same logic traps every other power too. China, Russia, Europe, all are caught in a cycle where fear justifies spending, and spending sustains fear. In chasing safety, the world is building a new kind of vulnerability, a dependency on conflict itself. Because the real danger isn't war, it's how normal the idea of war has become. If you want clear analysis without hype, subscribe to SafetyZone. The surge in global defense spending isn't just a reaction to fear, it's the symptom of an economic model that no longer knows how to slow down. For decades, growth has depended on constant consumption, technological expansion, and public debt. When those engines began to falter, governments quietly turned to something that never loses political support: security. In 2024, the global arms industry generated more than $700 billion in direct contracts. In 2025, it is projected to surpass $800 billion. That money doesn't vanish into the military. It circulates through civilian economies, factories, supply chains, research centers, and entire regions whose livelihoods depend on the next contract being signed. In the United States, over 15% of all manufacturing output is tied to defense, directly or indirectly. In practical terms, that means 1 in 10 American jobs relies on an industry that only exists because the world feels unsafe. The same dynamic shapes other powers. In China, the fusion of civilian and military industries, known as civil-military integration, keeps entire tech sectors funded under the label of national defense. In Russia, state-owned arms producers have become the main source of employment across regions once sustained by oil. In Europe, nations that once debated cutting military budgets now compete for contracts, with companies like BAE Systems, Leonardo, and Rheinmetall posting record profits. Across the planet, the logic is the same. When economies depend on weapons, tension becomes currency. Each new drone program, missile upgrade, or defensive modernization plan keeps the system running and the fear that justifies it alive. That is why, even in times of peace, the demand for arms continues to grow. The more fragile the economy, the more profitable the threat. And when the machinery of prosperity is welded to the machinery of war, stopping it becomes the greatest risk of all. The result is an illusion of stability powered by permanent instability, a world where growth itself depends on conflict not happening, but never ending. Because once defense becomes an industry, peace starts to look like a threat. The same logic that makes rearmament an economic engine also makes tension a form of political energy. What began as spending for security has evolved into a system that depends on anxiety to stay balanced. Governments have learned that fear unites faster than policy and distracts longer than reform. When people feel threatened, they stop asking why things aren't improving. Every new crisis becomes proof that vigilance is working. every confrontation a justification for more control. The cycle is efficient, almost self-sustaining. Economic pressure generates fear. Fear boosts defense demand, and defense spending stabilizes economies that would otherwise falter. For leaders, that loop is priceless. It transforms instability into authority. Democracies use it to maintain consensus and postpone hard choices. Autocracies use it to keep loyalty intact. The effect is the same. The longer the world stays on edge, the easier it becomes to govern. Even the markets have adapted. Every alert, every border clash, every cyber attack rumor pushes defense stocks higher. The more unstable the system looks, the more profitable it becomes for those who build its protection. News outlets, too, feed off that pulse. Fear drives attention. Attention drives revenue, and the narrative of constant threat becomes its own justification. What once felt like crisis now feels like normality. Because tension isn't just tolerated anymore, it's monetized. And the longer it lasts, the more every nation learns to live off it. When fear becomes profitable, it doesn't stay in the markets, it migrates into politics. Every government learns to use it, refining it into something measurable, predictable, and controllable. What began as an economic loop now becomes a political system. External threat turns into internal order. The logic is simple and universal. When people are afraid, they unite, and when they unite, they obey. Democracies call it leadership, autocracies call it protection, but both depend on the same equation: fear as legitimacy. In Washington, global leadership justifies budgets that would otherwise face resistance. In Moscow, defending identity silences dissent. In Beijing, protecting sovereignty defines loyalty itself. The vocabulary changes, the dependency does not. Power feeds on danger because it simplifies everything. When the enemy is outside, you don't have to explain what's wrong inside. Inflation, inequality, corruption, all become collateral damage in a larger struggle. And when media, politics, and defense merge into a single narrative of vigilance, citizens begin to accept the cost of control as the price of safety. That is the point where the system stabilizes not through trust, but through tension. It needs the threat to function. Without it, unity dissolves, attention fades, and authority weakens. The war everyone fears doesn't begin at the border, it begins in the language of governance. Because when fear becomes the operating system of power, peace becomes a threat to power itself. When fear becomes the foundation of power, trust turns into a threat. And that's exactly where the global system now lives, in a balance built on permanent suspicion. Alliances are still signed, but none are truly believed. Partnerships last only as long as both sides need them, and every treaty feels like a draft waiting to be rewritten the moment conditions shift. What used to be diplomacy has become risk management. This isn't chaos, it's design. The less nations trust each other, the more predictable their behavior becomes, because distrust narrows every choice. It makes each actor easier to read and easier to contain. The result is a strange efficiency, a world that keeps moving not because it's stable, but because no one dares to stop. For governments, distrust is insurance. It justifies budgets, surveillance, and the next round of rearmament. For industries, it guarantees demand. Every country that doubts its neighbor signs another contract, builds another system, buys another shield. And for markets, tension means liquidity, uncertainty means movement. The whole mechanism feeds itself. For those managing it, policymakers, investors, defense planners, real stability would be the only true disruption. Because peace would stop the flow, freeze production, and remove the need to coordinate through fear. That's why global politics doesn't collapse despite the distrust. It survives because of it. The logic is simple, brutal, and profitable. The more fear circulates, the safer the system feels. And if tension keeps everyone spending, who would really want it to end? For Washington, That question runs deeper than strategy. Ending the cycle of tension would mean dismantling the very system the U.S. built to keep itself safe and now can't live without. America remains the center of gravity in global defense, but that gravity is pulling in every direction at once. Sustaining deterrence across 5 simultaneous fronts: Europe, the Pacific, the Middle East, the Arctic, and Latin America, no longer just demands resources, it drains endurance. Every carrier that sails, every exercise announced, every alliance renewed, draws from the same reservoir of attention, money, and willpower. What once projected confidence now measures fatigue. The United States can't step back without looking weak, yet can't push forward without fueling accusations of provocation. It's a strategic treadmill, constant motion without progress, effort without pause. The real cost isn't in dollars or hardware, it's in erosion of focus, flexibility, and credibility. Beneath the machinery of power, there's a quieter fatigue. Commanders working through the night, diplomats managing crises on autopilot, a public that has forgotten what peace feels like. And still, the treadmill keeps moving. Every new crisis forces Washington to prove its reliability again, while its rivals only have to wait for hesitation. But America isn't alone in this trap. China is bound to expansion, Russia to confrontation, Europe to cohesion, and none of them can stop without exposing fragility. That's why the modern world feels permanently tense. No nation can pause without shaking the illusion of control. The system no longer runs on balance but on exhaustion. The more nations prepare for stability, the less stable the world becomes. The cycle of tension doesn't just drain budgets, it rewires how entire societies think. We now live in a state of permanent mobilization, where preparation itself has become identity. Every weapons test, every round of sanctions, every headline about readiness delivers the same quiet message. Confrontation is no longer a risk, it's the normal condition of power. Governments sustain this state because it legitimizes authority. A nation on alert will accept sacrifices it would never tolerate in peace, higher spending, deeper surveillance, fewer questions. Industries depend on it because it guarantees continuity. Defense contracts, energy extraction, cybersecurity, all thrive in an atmosphere where the next crisis feels inevitable. For citizens, the psychology of readiness becomes strangely comforting. To be prepared feels safer than to be calm. After years of warnings, people start fearing peace more than danger, silence more than noise. Even markets behave the same way. Stability is no longer the baseline, it's the anomaly. Traders, investors, and politicians move as if volatility itself were proof of life. That is how an entire generation learns to live in an age of permanent pre-crisis. History offers a precedent. The Cold War turned vigilance into a virtue and anxiety into a civic duty. But today, the cycle spins faster. Information travels at the speed of light. Satellite feeds stream conflict in real time. And every explosion anywhere becomes part of a continuous global rehearsal. The irony is that this readiness, meant to prevent disaster, makes catastrophe easier to imagine and easier to accept. The world is not merely preparing for war, it's performing it psychologically, day after day, until the line between prevention and provocation dissolves. When societies start to think like soldiers, peace becomes a tactical pause, not a destination. And the danger is that one day the drill won't stop. The world doesn't have to be at war to think like it already is, and that's how preparation turns into prophecy. The world doesn't want a war, but it's building one, layer by layer, in every policy, every budget, every exercise labeled as prevention. We call it deterrence, but deterrence has a breaking point. Every system has it. And right now, the global order is running too close to the edge. When every radar is on, every submarine deployed, every satellite armed with algorithms that make decisions faster than humans can react, the line between readiness and catastrophe becomes a matter of seconds, not intent. A misread blip, a wrong translation, a drone malfunction, That's all it takes. The next global crisis won't start with strategy, but with routine. Because when nations live in a permanent state of alert, the extraordinary becomes invisible and mistakes become inevitable. This is the hidden cost of constant preparation. The world keeps tightening the spring and calls it safety. But springs don't hold forever. They snap. And when they do, it's never in slow motion. The risk ahead isn't philosophical, it's mechanical. A single error, multiplied by the speed of modern systems, can cross the point of no return before anyone can even issue an order to stop. The tragedy is that no one would choose it, but everyone is setting the conditions for it. That's how civilizations end, not by a conscious decision to destroy themselves, but by building structures too complex to survive their own tension. The closer we come to mastering control, the more fragile control becomes. Because when peace itself becomes unsustainable, conflict stops being a choice. If you want analysis that separates fear from fact, subscribe to SafetyZone.